Waverly Hills Sanatorium, located in Louisville, Kentucky, has always been shrouded in mystery and fear. Since I was a child, I heard rumors about the hospital, where thousands died of tuberculosis. I never imagined I'd have the courage to visit it, but when I finally went, the hospital seemed to be waiting for me, wrapped in silence and darkness. The air was heavy, as if the building itself was filled with dark secrets. As I entered, I was overwhelmed by an inexplicable cold. The silence was dense, and each step echoed like a warning to leave. As I walked down the main hallway, I heard distant footsteps, yet the hospital was empty. It felt as if former patients still wandered there, leaving an unsettling feeling that sent chills down my spine. The corridors seemed endless, each one darker than the last. I was alone, but I felt an invisible presence following me. As I moved forward, shadows stretched across the walls, shifting strangely. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if something was waiting. As I passed a sign reading, "Room 502, I felt a sudden chill. They say this room is the most haunted, where a nurse took her own life decades ago. Reluctantly, I approached the door, trying to listen for anything. The air around was icy and heavy, as if the space still held the pain of that tragedy. I stepped into the room, and the silence there was almost deafening. The air seemed to grow thicker, and a scent of old disinfectant permeated the space. I stood still for a few seconds, observing every corner. Then, a low whisper began to echo, almost as if someone were trying to speak to me. The whisper was faint but insistent, as if it were coming from all directions. I looked around, trying to locate the source, but no one was there. The voice seemed to carry a deep sadness, and I wondered if I was hearing echoes from the past. A shiver took over me, but I couldn't move. When I tried to leave the room, the door wouldn't open. I pushed and pulled, but it seemed locked from the inside. The whisper grew louder, turning into an agonizing wail. It was as if something was desperately trying to get my attention. Panic began to rise within me. Suddenly, the door opened on its own, and I rushed out. The corridor seemed darker, and the shadows on the walls appeared denser. I looked back and for an instant saw a white figure in room 502 watching me. The figure vanished, but that image remained etched in my mind. As I continued exploring, I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped several times, but the sound would stop the moment I turned around. Still, the feeling of being followed persisted, and each step I took seemed to lead me deeper into the mystery of that hospital. Something there seemed to want to find me. Waverly Hills is known for its stories of shadows and voices. Many say the hospital holds the souls of those who died there. At that moment, I believed every story. I felt an overwhelming sadness, as if the building was saturated with the suffering of those who lived and died there. I entered a room filled with old beds. Handprints were on the walls, as if someone had tried to escape. It was a terrifying sight, and the cold in there was almost unbearable. It was as if time had stopped, and each object in that room carried the pain of the patients. I felt a presence beside me, as if someone were approaching. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the fear, but the sound of a whisper persisted. When I opened my eyes, I saw a shadow next to me, almost touching my shoulder. My instinct screamed for me to run, but something held me there. A voice whispered near my ear, "Help me." I turned, but no one was there. Silence returned, but those words echoed in my mind, bringing a feeling of dread and sadness. I knew the hospital held something dark, something that would never let me leave. As I moved away, the feeling of being watched persisted. Even outside room 502, I felt someone following me. Every shadow seemed to take shape, and the air vibrated with an invisible energy. I realized that Waverly Hills wasn't just a place. It was a living presence, waiting patiently. When I finally left the hospital, the oppressive feeling didn't disappear. The voice still echoed, like a desperate plea. Cursed by that experience, I knew I'd never fully be free. Waverly Hills would continue to haunt me, trapped in my memory. The old Ashwood Sanatorium was a place few dared to visit. Abandoned for over half a century, it stood isolated, surrounded by dense forest. Rumor had it that the building held echoes of patients who never left. Entering there was to feel the weight of a dark history, where the walls seemed to watch, and the air carried the pain and suffering of those who perished within its rooms. There were 5 of us: me, Jack, Emily, Sarah, and Mike, all med students, too curious for our own good. Ashwood was infamous for brutal medical experiments conducted by a doctor whose identity had been erased from records. However, his methods left deep scars in the corridors. We were eager to uncover the truth, but as we moved deeper, the dark atmosphere started to weigh on us. Jack led the way, holding a flashlight that illuminated the peeling walls. The place was steeped in the smell of mold and decay. It felt like time had stopped. As we walked through the empty halls, shadows flickered at the edges of our vision. Tension grew among us, each sound echoing, and the walls seemed to whisper our names, as if the sanatorium itself was trying to drive us away. We reached a ward where old medical equipment was covered in dust. Emily stopped, fascinated, examining a strange device with rusty straps and levers. Mike joked that this was where the Doctor of Shadows performed his surgeries. I laughed, but something in me knew it wasn't a joke. There, in the darkness, the past felt more alive than ever, and the atmosphere was terrifying. In a dark corner, we found medical records. The pages were yellowed, but some words were still legible. Patient unresponsive. Experimental method. Extreme risk. Sarah stepped back, her expression frightened. Jack tried to calm everyone, but it was too late. What was recorded there was more than we could imagine. It felt as if we had violated something forbidden. The flashlight flickered, and Jack shook it. Suddenly, a shadow passed down the corridor. We stopped. The silence was crushing. Mike tried to shine light in the area, but the shadow had disappeared. Each of us looked at each other, as if we'd all seen the same thing. It was as if the sanatorium was coming to life, and there was no denying the presence of something far beyond our understanding. I wanted to leave, but curiosity pushed us forward. We decided to explore the basement, where the most gruesome surgeries were said to happen. The steps were damp and creaked under our feet. The hallway below was dark and foreboding, with a locked door at the end. Jack tried to open it but failed. Then, suddenly, it opened on its own, revealing a room filled with old surgical instruments. Emily was uneasy, but Jack stepped inside. The room was cold and the air felt heavy. In every corner there were rusty, stained instruments, as if they had been abandoned mid-procedure. Suddenly, a metallic sound echoed. We looked around, but the room was empty. However, we felt that something or someone was watching us, an invisible yet powerful presence. As Jack inspected the equipment, the light flickered again, and we all froze. That's when we heard a low voice, almost a whisper, calling, "Doctor!" The sound echoed through the room, as if it were coming from within the walls. Sarah began to shake, and I could feel the fear rising within me. Something was definitely wrong. Mike tried to make us laugh to ease the tension, but no one responded. Fear had already taken over. We felt we were being watched by invisible eyes, trapped under the vigilant gaze of the Doctor of Shadows. Every second in the room increased the terror. We wanted to leave, but something held us there, as if we were bound by a force beyond our control. We decided to leave the room, but when we turned, the door had closed. We tried to open it, but it was locked. Emily began to cry, and Jack was trying to force the door without success. The whisper grew louder, as if desperate voices were calling for help. We were trapped, and panic spread among us. It was as if the sanatorium wanted to keep us there forever. In the midst of the despair, I heard heavy footsteps approaching. We all fell silent, and the room seemed to shrink. The door creaked and slowly opened, revealing a tall, indistinct shadow. It looked like the reflection of a doctor, with a mask and a coat, and its gaze was empty and threatening. We didn't know if it was real or a nightmare, but the fear was palpable. Jack tried to move, but the figure raised its hand and he froze in place. The shadow seemed to absorb the energy in the room, and we felt our strength draining. The figure pointed to the old surgical instruments, as if it wanted us to experience the pain of the former patients. This was the end, and there was no way to escape this living nightmare. As the shadow approached, I felt my vision darkening. It was as if I was being sucked into an abyss, my consciousness fading. Before I lost sense, I heard a whisper. "Welcome to my treatment." The figure seemed to smile, and then everything went dark. I was trapped in a place where suffering never ended. Days later, the sanatorium was found empty, but no trace of the 5 students was found. It's said that the whispers of young, desperate voices echo through the hallways at night. Those who try to explore Ashwood feel a chilling presence, as if the Doctor of Shadows is still searching for new souls for his eternal experiments. Pine Hills Sanatorium was lost in the Texas desert, hidden between hills and twisted trees. It was a full moon night, and the building looked more like a living shadow than an abandoned structure. Rachel, Tom, Jesse, and Ben decided to explore the place, drawn by the legend of the forgotten patient, a man who, according to rumors, still haunted the dark halls of Wing B. As they passed through the main door, a smell of mold and decay enveloped them. The air was dense, and every step echoed through the empty corridors. The walls were covered in moss and graffiti, but one detail caught their attention. In the direction of Wing B, there were handprints, as if someone had desperately tried to escape. Tom led the group, lighting the way with a shaky flashlight. The place seemed frozen in time, as if the shadows of former patients still roamed there. As they approached Wing B, a low creak echoed, making them all stop. They looked around, but there was nothing. Just oppressive silence. Rachel hesitated when she saw the Wing B sign, where the name Mr. Kane was awkwardly scratched out. They said he was forgotten when the sanatorium closed, left to die in his cell. An uneasy feeling washed over the group, but, curious, they decided to continue. The door creaked as Tom pushed it, and darkness enveloped them. As they entered Wing B, Rachel felt as if she was being watched. The walls were narrow, and the air was colder. Tom's flashlight illuminated rusty metal doors, each marked with the number of a former patient. They passed by the cells, but one of them looked different. The cell numbered 13. Jesse stopped in front of cell 13, intrigued. The door was slightly ajar, and inside was a rusty wheelchair. Suddenly, the chair began to move slowly, as if someone invisible was pushing it. The group froze, and the silence was broken only by the sound of the chair creaking across the floor. Ben suggested they leave, but Tom was determined to uncover the truth. They entered cell 13, trying to understand what caused the movement. As they inspected the chair, they noticed an inscription on the seat, with crooked letters. "I am here." Rachel stepped back, a chill running down her spine. A low sound began to echo through the corridor, something like heavy breathing, interspersed with whispers. The group looked around, trying to find the source, but no one was there. The air grew colder, and a feeling of oppression surrounded them. Jessie held Ben's hand, her eyes wide with fear. Rachel heard a whisper close to her ear, soft and sinister. "Help me." She jumped and looked around, but saw no one. Tom tried to calm her, but deep down, he was also scared. It felt as if Mr. Kane was there, among them, waiting for something. Perhaps a treatment he never received. They began to back away, but the cell door slammed shut, trapping them. Jessie pounded on the door, screaming for someone to open it, but the cold metal didn't budge. The heavy breathing grew closer, and a shadow appeared at the back of the cell. The friends were trapped, and panic began to set in. The shadow moved closer, taking shape. It was a tall, gaunt figure with empty eyes and a disfigured face. He reached out, and the group pressed against the wall. It was Mr. Kane, or what was left of him. The figure seemed full of hatred and pain, as if he had been waiting for years to escape his prison. Ben tried to calm the figure, murmuring that they were only there to explore. But Mr. Kane didn't seem to hear. He moved toward Jessie, who was trembling with fear. With a sudden motion, the shadow ran his hand over her face, and she collapsed, as if all her energy had been drained. Tom and Rachel tried to wake Jessie, but her eyes were glazed, empty, as if she were in a deep trance. The shadow looked at them, its lifeless eyes seeming hungry for more. They understood that Mr. Kane wanted revenge and wouldn't stop until they all shared in his suffering. Suddenly, the door opened on its own, and Ben pulled Tom and Rachel out, leaving Jessie behind. They ran down the dark corridor, hearing the heavy breathing and footsteps of the shadow behind them. When they reached the exit, they looked back and saw Jessie's face in the dark, alongside Mr. Kane. Months later, only Tom and Rachel spoke of what happened that night. Ben was never seen again, and rumors said he had also been forgotten in the sanatorium. Local legends now spoke of two figures in Wing B, wandering side by side, waiting for new souls to join the forgotten patient. The old Santa Fe Sanatorium, in the hills of New Mexico, was feared by locals. Stories were told about a wing called the Wisper ward, where mysterious voices echoed even after the sanatorium was shut down. On a full moon night, 3 friends, Laura, Mike, and Josh, decided to explore the place, curious about the legends and drawn by the promise of a terrifying night. As they entered, the air was cold, and the smell of mold was strong. The sanatorium seemed untouched by time, with dark hallways and peeling walls. Each step they took echoed as if the building were alive, whispering. Laura felt a chill and, for a moment, thought she heard someone calling her name. But when she looked around, she saw only her friends. Mike led the group with a flashlight, lighting the way through the main hall. The place was shrouded in darkness, and shadows seemed to move at the edge of their vision. The further they went, the more Laura felt an invisible presence around them. It was as if they were being watched from every direction. They reached the Wisper ward, a wide room with old, rusty beds lined up along the walls. The atmosphere was heavy, and a deep silence surrounded them. At the back of the room, a curtain was partially open, and Laura felt an irresistible urge to approach it. With each step she took, her sense of dread grew. As she got closer to the curtain, Laura heard a soft whisper, almost like a prayer. She looked back, but Mike and Josh were farther away, distracted. Determined, she pulled the curtain aside, revealing an empty chair facing a foggy window. A sense of sadness washed over her, and the whisper continued, now closer, as if someone were beside her. Suddenly, a soft, desperate voice called her name. "Laura!" She froze, feeling fear spread through her body. She looked around, but no one was there. The whispers began to grow louder, echoing throughout the ward. Mike and Josh finally noticed what was happening and approached, but Laura seemed trapped in some sort of trance. Mike tried to pull Laura, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the empty chair, where he could now see a faint shadow, like the figure of a woman sitting. The woman seemed to be murmuring something, and the whispers grew louder. Josh gripped the flashlight tightly, feeling fear take hold of the group. The woman seemed to look at them, but her eyes were empty, as if she were trapped between two worlds. Suddenly, the whispers turned into a low, dark laugh, echoing through the room. Laura whispered that the woman was a nurse who cared for patients in the ward, but she could never leave them behind, even in death. Josh felt something cold touch his shoulder and turned, but there was no one. The room grew colder, and the whispers now formed clearer words. "Help us. Don't leave us here." The voice sounded desperate, filled with pain. The 3 were paralyzed, unable to move as the presence drew closer. Laura began to cry, murmuring that she could feel the nurses and patients suffering. It was as if their pain had clung to the walls, and now they sought someone to listen. Mike, trying to stay strong, suggested they leave immediately, but the whispers seemed to root their feet to the ground. Finally, they managed to move toward the exit, but the door was locked. Mike pulled the handle, but something seemed to hold it shut. The dark laugh returned, louder, as the figure of the nurse rose from the chair. Her movements were slow, and her empty eyes now seemed focused on Laura. The nurse began whispering Laura's name, louder each time, until it sounded like a scream. Laura tried to cover her ears, but the voice echoed inside her head. The others tried to help her, but their movements were slow and heavy, as if the air itself was pulling them down. Mike realized that the only way out was to confront the figure. He approached, asking what she wanted, but the nurse only continued to whisper. Suddenly she stopped, tilting her head and murmuring, "Did you come to save us?" Her empty eyes seemed to focus on Mike, who felt his courage waver. The moment Mike responded, the figure vanished, and the door opened. They ran outside, breathing a sigh of relief, but something was wrong. When they looked at Laura, they realized she was strangely silent, her eyes empty, as if she could still hear the whispers. Laura never fully recovered from that night. Locals claim that if you pass near the sanatorium, you can still hear whispers, as if the nurse's soul found a new companion. And on full moon nights, someone always swears they see a figure in the window, waiting for someone to come and listen to her call.